All right, welcome everyone to the final pre-course on Hegel's Science of Logic. In this course, we're going to, or this aspect of the course, we're going to be going into Hegel's logic itself, the development of Hegel's logic itself. So strap up, we've got the foundations in place, we've got the background in place, and now going into, let's say, the thing in itself. Okay, but before we do, this is all pre-course, meaning that we're heading into the actual Science of Logic course, actually starting tomorrow. There are 4 tiers available. So if you're interested in joining me, as well as other course instructors over the next 4 months, we are going to be going head on into this beast and find out more at philosophyportal.online/the science of logic. Okay, and as I mentioned, this is the 5th and final part of the pre-course. So if you watch this as a little series, what this little series is going to do is give you a rather, I think, comprehensive overview of the context and the background that you need to understand someone like Hegel in his historical moment. You're going to get his formative moments. You're going to get his work with the phenomenology. You're going to get some perspectives from his contemporaries, Immanuel Kant and Johann Fichte, as well as Hegel's response to these figures, and finally Hegel's logic itself. So it all leads up to this one, really. And here Hegel's logic is, built on the symbol there is basically built on the foundation being nothing for becoming. And it's really, I think, reflectively powerful to think on this little minimal atom of being nothing becoming. And it opens up some really interesting ideas and also puts, I think, post-Hegelian philosophy into a pretty profound context, especially considering that a lot of post-Hegelian philosophy focuses so heavily on the concept of becoming. Okay, so Hegel's logic is based and founded on the dialectic. And one of the interesting things here is that Hegel's dialectic is almost synonymous with also words like discourse and dialogue, meaning that they have similar meanings. Really what the philosophy is aimed at is, let's say, logos in or as a becoming. And this is perhaps interesting to differentiate from pre-modern or pre-Hegelian philosophy, where the logos is perceived in more of an eternalistic way. Even if you think about, for example, Kant's a priori categories. Kant's a priori categories are kind of eternalistic categories. So even Kant here is not so much really capable of thinking the logos as a becoming. Perhaps also we could name figures like Spinoza, or we could also name figures like Plato as figures who struggle to think logos also as becoming. And so here we're really challenged, and throughout the, and really what's at stake in working through the science of logic is precisely thinking this notion. And Hegel here in the science of logic will give us his approach to deriving the idea of logos as becoming. Now, what he derives is basically a logical structure that starts with qualitative what's, this or that. And so he starts with qualities which can be contained by categories. And you see there little domain trees and little triangles that build up structure. And Hegel will be doing that throughout the science of logic. Like, one of the implicit treats in reading the science of logic is sort of getting a sort of meta insight into the method by which Hegel derives his concepts in little triads, these little almost like, well, it moves through the method of a dialectical process where new concepts emerge from the antagonism between 2 previous concepts, and these triads build up throughout the logic. And it's really, I think, following ideas from Walter Kaufmann and other sort of scholars. This idea is that what Hegel is doing is basically a series of logical triads upon triads upon triads. Okay, so the first concepts he introduced, again, starting now, what I want to emphasize here is that he starts with being and nothing as qualities of, I don't even want to say qualities of experience, because experience itself is derived from being and nothing. So it's kind of like you can't have an experience without being and nothing as qualities already sort of assumed, sort of thing. But the first concepts he does derive from the qualities of being and nothing are concepts finitude, limitation, and infinity. And there's something I think really interesting about those being sort of the first concepts he derives. I mean, when you have a particular being, it is by definition finite, unless it's, of course, a pure being, which would be an infinite being in the classical categories of thinking. But considering here we're starting with qualities of being and nothing, we're starting with a finite being that is also a limited being. And it is from sort of focusing on the idea of a limited being where Hegel derives notions of false and true infinity. So, and these are endlessly fascinating to think about this distinction of let's say, true and false infinity. Let me first articulate what for Hegel is a false infinity. A false infinity for Hegel is spurious, and you can look this up online. Spurious infinity is a well-known concept. And it's basically an idea of an endless series without, of course, an endless series. It's a series of beings without end. I first sort of spontaneously encountered the idea of a spurious infinity when I realized that the natural numbers have no end, meaning that you could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you can keep counting forever. There is actually no number which brings the series to an end. So in some sense, natural numbers conceived in this way are a spurious infinity. Now, it gets more interesting when you apply ideas of spurious infinity to existential being. When you think about desire, desire in some sense operates on a spurious infinity of an endless series of objects which you can never satisfy, right? There's always another object to purchase. Capitalism in some sense functions on spurious infinity, at least from the perspective of the consumer and also the producer, I suppose, as well. Both consumers and producers are in a type of weird spurious infinity of endless objects, right? Both endless objects to produce and endless objects to consume, and this creates a certain motor. Now, Hegel doesn't stop with that. He also says that there is something called a true infinity. And for Hegel, this is where being becomes self-relating. So already from the beginning of Hegel's concepts, where he's starting with being and nothing as immediate qualities, we get the possibility of a mediation, which Hegel links to true infinity, which I think we can also link to the idea of logos in becoming. It's basically a self-abiding. And the difference between a spurious and a self-abiding infinity is basically that you are always already there. You are always already in a process of logical becoming, mediating your process of logical becoming. And you sort of get out of the mindset that you fall into with spurious infinity. It's not that spurious infinity disappears. It's almost like a perspectival shift on spurious infinity from the point of view of a self-abiding, meaning that, for example, if you are trying to fill up your self-worth with, for example, capitalist objects of production, or it could be anything, it could be food, it could be a sexual partner. I think these are really important notions to reflect on. If you approach those same phenomena from the perspective of a self-abiding, there is, for Hegel, all the difference in the world in that minimal distinction. So being itself is constituted by an endless series of whats or parts of reflection. The whats are for Hegel qualia. If you think about in modern philosophy, the idea of qualia is a word that's demonstrated or it's a word that represents how things appear to us, the quality of how things appear to us. And parts quanta is basically the way in which how things appear to us can be quantified, can be measured, and that is a very important aspect of Hegel's philosophy. Not only that things appear to us, but that these things which appear to us can be meaningfully categorized, measured, processed through mathematical computations or calculus, as also is important for Hegel. And that how we measure progress is based on basically rules of measurement, or more precisely, the range that allows the entrance of things into a certain play. So I have here just two images which are, it's an example. We could use many, many more examples. But here you have parts on the left-hand side. Now, those parts become something more than just the parts. They become a whole when they are arranged in a certain way. There are certain rules for building that car. And once you know the rules for building that car, you can produce an endless number of cars, right? So this is sort of the magic of the automation line. This is the magic of the assembly line, which has become so dominant in industrial capitalism. But we can also think about this in spiritual or social terms, not just in mechanical terms. Meaning for Hegel, the measure of progress from his day, when he's living in a nation state of Germany, to the present day, where that same nation state is now within something called the European Union, and that European Union is itself nested within larger international structures. What that means is that there's been a progress for entrance into new sets of rules, where larger and larger wholes emerge from the play of their parts. So the parts in the case of Germany would be precisely rules entertaining the relationship between their neighboring nation states, which bring together something called the European Union, where there's a new play going on. There's a new range of rules which has been established, which now determines how the parts can interact with each other. So it's from this relationship between parts and wholes, and then you could extrapolate that logic to think about what would a global international order actually look like, for example. And this logic can go on and on and on, and we could play with it with many different examples. But here, this is the sort of minimal distinctions that Hegel's making. It's basically, the space, how you want to think about this is it's almost like the space of constraint that opens up a new performativity, or opens up new conditions of possibility, right? Like the type of action or the range of action which is possible for Germany without the European Union versus Germany with the European Union is totally different. It's totally transformed by the new range of rules, let's say. Okay, so this brings us to the concept of measure, which is situated in relation to power ratios. So now let me first unpack what this means in historical context. One of the things that's central for Hegel throughout his career is the relationship between philosophy and mathematics. And Hegel is constantly emphasizing that mathematics is not superior to philosophy, but rather needs a new philosophical underlying logic in order to make sense of its own advances, meaning that maths cannot solve its own philosophical problems. And more interestingly, that math, and specifically the emergence of calculus, does not understand its own emergence. I think Hegel would say the same thing about science, that both science and maths do not while they can operate with the new methods, they don't understand the philosophical meaning of these new methods and tools and techniques. Right, so Hegel's concerned with basically the philosophical meaning of calculus, and he thinks about this in relationship to the quantitative study of nature. What is the philosophical meaning of the emergence of science, the emergence of calculus, and large-scale quantitative studies of nature? We're going to get into what that really means, and this has distinct consequences for Hegel's relation specifically. I'll sort of preface this by saying this has deep meaning for Hegel's relationship to figures like Spinoza, but we'll get into that. So specifically here with calculus, we have terms of a ratio being measured against each other. So the crucial thing here is that you have two identities in a contradictory relation, which are processing each other, and where the result of their processing will be other than both of the identities, right? So this is the crucial thing. And so it's the tension between the two terms which produces a new identity, which is basically, a mirror of the way Hegel's thinking about dialectics. He says, being acquires a formal self-containment or a true infinity with the emergence of this measuring process. And here, what we're really talking about is the capacity for humans in terms of our epistemological constructs, our knowing, to basically produce new being through these processes. And if you think about what characterizes the emergence of science, the emergence of industrialization, and then we can move closer to our present moment, and you can think about the information age. What we're really seeing is the human capacity through our knowing processes to produce new types of being. And for Hegel, this is the consequence of a new form of self-containment of becoming, which did not exist before the emergence of, let's say, science and calculus. So Hegel's interested in the consequence of measure. And here he has a nice little formula which repeats throughout the science of logic, which is that so again, I want to emphasize, we start with quality, and then we move to quantity, and then you can measure quantity in this way where the identities are being played off in a tension with each other. And it's obvious that the mathematicians and the scientists understand that measurement is crucial, and they understand that quantification leads us to a new domain other than quality. But what Hegel emphasizes, and I think this is so crucial and it's so interesting to think, is that once you've moved through the quantification process, the measurement process, a new quality emerges, a quality with a difference, a new quality that didn't exist before the internal resistance of the measure. So there's a result, and this is so crucial for Hegel's thinking as well, if we follow from the phenomenology of spirit, where so much of what Hegel's focused on is the result of a process. And he's saying that the very result of measurement, the very result of quantification, introduces this new qualitative difference. And so we have this relation where, and it's related to this interesting form of, let's say, epistemological containment, where quantity absorbs an indeterminate quality. You process a certain phenomena that is indeterminate, that you precisely is unintelligible to you in terms of its identity. And then it acquires a new depth from this enhanced self-containment or a new logical becoming. Now, it's also interesting to note that we can think about our very self like this. I mean, when you think about, even if you think about in our contemporary ideological landscape where there's ideas about quantification of the self, like, let's say you go to university. What really is going on in university is a type of containment of your logical becoming, which precisely has certain ways to measure you, grades, tests, certain forms of your, basically testing your intelligence. And it's from this quantification process where the result of that process is a new quality, meaning you're now a postgraduate of a university. Now, Hegel's thinking about this in all different sorts of ways, but he's applying it to the basic way in which becoming occurs. And I could go deeper into this, but precisely the point of the course is to go deeper into these ideas. I think one of the things I want to emphasize here is just, we have to think, whenever we have a qualitative immediacy, we have to think about how are we containing that qualitative immediacy? And through that containment, through that quantitative measurement process, what new quality emerges on the other side? That's crucial. So Hegel claims intellectuals misunderstood the nature of calculus. So again, this is sort of mirroring what I've already said about Hegel's basic idea that scientists and philosophers of the scientific revolution didn't really understand, they didn't have the self-awareness or the self sort of the reflective capacity to understand what it was they were actually introducing into being. It hadn't been philosophically sense made yet. So we did have an internal conceptual development related to quantity, that is, like, figures like Descartes' Cartesian coordinates, and Newtonian formulas and quantities related to the foundation of classical mechanics. This is the development of a new quantity, but what was not predicted by figures like Descartes and Newton, and this is something I always emphasize on podcasts and stuff like that, is that it's not that Newton's reflecting sort of a new objective being. It's more that Newton is opening up the conditions of possibility for space travel, for example. Like, that space travel is the new quality, the new truth for itself, which was not possible before that internal conceptual development. So something new appears. And here, what's so underrated in Hegel's philosophy is his capacity to think the new. And I think that there's been a tremendous obfuscation of Hegel's work as it relates to his capacity to think newness, perhaps precisely because of the work of Deleuze and this idea that Hegel could not think the emergence of the radically new or the genuinely new. But it seems to me, when you go deep into the science of logic, that really what Hegel's trying to do is understand how something new comes into existence. So then we run into this idea of actual infinities, which are magnitudes. So again, with this idea of the infinity not being the spurious infinity, but a self-abiding infinity, we get this idea of magnitudes that cannot be exhausted, but are still clear and distinct. Now, this is a very complicated concept, but it's also an incredibly important concept. So when we think about infinity in our traditional notion of infinity, we can think about something that's almost impossibly large, so large it can't be measured. But what Hegel's talking about is an infinity, a self-abiding infinity, an infinity within quality and quantity, which is precisely because I think it's related to the nature of the self. So again, back to this idea of a self-abiding, that you get something enormous, but it's still distinct. And I think that this is where we would place the idea of the name, right? So when we have, like, for example, the name Cadell. Well, Cadell, as I exist today, is in some sense an actual infinity that has emerged as a new quality from being quantitatively processed through various different forms of contained becoming. And the name means that I have a certain clarity, I have a certain distinction, meaning you can interact with me and relate to me meaningfully as Cadell, the name. However, I cannot be exhausted by your current determinations. So you have this paradox. And so this paradox is where Hegel introduces the all concept, which escapes typical notions of quantification. Now, what I want to say here is that what this foreshadows is Lacan's notion of the all and the non-all, where the problem for many, let's say, master signifiers, let's say like names, like Cadell, is that they assume that they are an all without a non-all. And what this means, what this implies, is that you have an all concept, which is basically exhausted because there's no non-all. What we're dealing with here is an all, a self-abiding infinity, which is in some sense inexhaustible. It keeps its capacity for becoming is inexhaustible. And that's actually very interesting because it connects to Heidegger's notion of the inexhaustibility of interpretation. And in the course, we're going to get more into the relationship between Heidegger and Hegel. So that's something to watch out for, and that's going to be an interesting aspect of the course. I just have the image there of Thanatos because Thanatos is this image of an enormous magnitude, right? He's this enormous being, but he's still at the same time as Thanatos, clear and distinct, and at the same time inexhaustible. constantly growing, constantly adding new rings, new infinity stones. And so this is what Hegel's trying to get at here with this idea of a self-contained actual infinity. So conceptual measure, now this is crucial for his relationship to other philosophers, and we're going to get more into specifics of that relation to other philosophers, but the introduction of a conceptual measure is how Hegel sheds categories of subjectivity. What his main goal is to derive the objective concept. And for Hegel, you need measurement to achieve the objective concept. And Hegel's whole problem with figures like Spinoza, like Kant, is precisely that they treat substance as almost like this externality which can never be objectively measured. And as a consequence of that, for Kant, is that you get this noumenal otherness. But for Spinoza, you get this idea that substance is doomed to negation, doomed to absolute nothingness. And that's another idea that we're going to go into great detail in the course itself, because Hegel actually directs a lot of his remarks to figures like Kant, to figures like Spinoza. And he's basically saying that both of these figures in their approach to the absolute actually do not understand, let's say, logos in becoming or the absolute as a process of becoming, but rather find themselves in a type of negativity by not taking negativity seriously, paradoxically. So the concept here is essential for natural intelligibility, that is processes of measurement which constitute the scientific revolution, processes of measurement which constitute the modern world. And now his philosophical claim is that it is only with the emergence of science and with the emergence of our capacity to measure nature, like for example, you see there those chemical signification processes on that image, it's only then that nature gains an internal stability with depth which it otherwise lacks. So Hegel's not saying that nature doesn't exist without us, but he is saying that nature gains its intelligibility from us, meaning from the concept. And we find out also, we can also extrapolate that from this, is that we find out the truth of nature from the concept and from the we don't, and this is so crucial, and this is well recognized in the philosophy of science, is that we do not know the destiny or the imminence of scientific processes of conceptualization. We do not know what nature will look like. We did not know what nature would look like now 100 years ago. Likewise, we do not know what nature will look like 100 years from now, inclusive of all of our measurement and our conceptual capacities. You know, there are a lot of popular books, for example, which talk about the future of physics, the future of technology. And it's precisely these books in a popular form, which Hegel is trying to make sense of the conditions of possibility for such popular speculations. So what does it mean that we live in a universe, or we live in a reality, or however you want to say it, where conceptual intelligibility transforms what it is that nature is in terms of its own conditions of possibility? All right, so the immediacy of becoming, its generation and its containment is now the issue for Hegel. And this issue of the generation and containment of becoming, I think, is an incredibly topical issue. Meaning that we have lots of talk of becoming, and we have in our social spheres, in our spiritual spheres especially, also our technological spheres, we have problems of containment. We have problems of social containment after, you know, the death of religion and death of various forms of political regimes, which tried to basically take the place of religion. You have the emergence of different forms of orthodoxy, fundamentalisms. You also have the problem of many new technologies where we do not have a coherent political framework for their generation and their containment. And so when we think about the 21st century as, let's say, a deepening of becoming, here, I think Hegel's logic is essential because, but what he's basically saying is that we need the frames of logic which allow us to think how this new form of becoming is contained. Even when you think about something like what I'm doing with Philosophy Portal, it's basically a containment issue. If you think about new schools that are emerging that are trying to meet more holistic needs of intelligibility as opposed to reductionist motives to intelligibility, what we're dealing with here are containment issues. And so for Hegel in his system, he's saying that when you think about containment, you have to think about it from the perspective of being, essence, and concept. And a lot of what we're going to get into in the science of logic is what does Hegel mean by these? How does Hegel derive essence and concept from being? And how do these three aspects go together? So one of the things that characterizes the emergence of essence and concept from being for Hegel is that logic confronts ever more complex forms of being oneself and being in the other. And so if you think about complex relationality, self and other, it could be a marriage partner, it could be a friendship, it could be a political organization, it could be, starting a new business. Whatever it happens to be, there are these feedback loops between self and other where you're confronted with ever more complex forms. If you think about a long-term intimate relationship and think about how in the modern world, we're having more and more problems with the containment of libido, right? The containment that works for a long-term relationship or a long-term friendship. The reason why we're having these containment problems is because we're having to deal with ever more complex forms of oneself and the other. And so this relationship between the two is really what's at stake in understanding the logos as a becoming, because you always have to remain reflectively aware of self and other as new complex forms emerge from their interrelation and their interaction. Again, a containment issue. So in this process of complexification and containment, there is the unfolding or the actualization of intelligibility, which must absorb referential processes. What that means is that you can no longer just have a detached intellect, which is not including self-reflection. You have to, and this is in part leaving spurious infinity for true infinity, or a self-contained infinity, and seeing your name, the person you're building, the person you're becoming, to see that as a containment process, a reflective containment process. So in that process, Hegel says that there's a real metaphysical movement which is propelled by contradiction of essential categories, of ground, of existence, of appearance, meaning that when you think about the ground of your being, it could be your home. When you think about your existence, your day-to-day experience, or when you think about appearance, the way qualia, the way things appear to you, Hegel says our becoming occurs through a contradiction of these categories. And this is totally different from the way pre-Hegelian philosophers thought of these categories. Because when philosophers thought about categories like ground, like existence, like appearance, they weren't thinking from the perspective of contradiction. They were thinking from the perspective of the identity of these categories. Like, let's find a ground, let's find real existence, let's find the true appearance. They weren't thinking about these categories as a becoming of contradiction. And also think about the emotional intensity that is required to actually reflectively mediate these categories. If your ground is constantly in contradiction, if your existence is constantly in contradiction, if the appearances are constantly in contradiction, this requires that you stay awake. This requires that you are reflectively absorbing process constantly. And it's a becoming which is never going to end, until you die, I suppose. So these metaphysical categories are objective for Hegel. And so in that sense, he agrees with Spinoza But the problem is not seeing them as categories. So, the problem is not seeing them as contradictory. So on the right-hand side there, you see basically an outline of Spinoza's metaphysical system. The problem is for Hegel is that things that are associated with subjectivity, thinking, extension, belief, desire, well, let's go on the one hand, the substance subject split is on the substance end, you would have extension. On the subjective end, you would have thinking, and then it would further bifurcate into belief, desire, and so forth. The problem is for Hegel with Spinoza is that Spinoza does not see those things as fundamental. They're kind of epiphenomenal to, let's say, the one and only substance. And so as a consequence of not taking thinking, belief, desire as a part of the absolute, as a fundamental part of the absolute, he's not capable of thinking the historical becoming of subjectivity and the contradictoriness of substance. Okay. So in Hegel's work, he gets to a place which Spinoza cannot, from his point of view, which is that logic moves from products of nature to products of spirit. So instead of reducing substance to nothing, which is ultimately what happens in Spinoza's philosophy, and I think Spinoza's philosophy here works really well with a classical view of physics, meaning that in contemporary physics with ideas of entropy, you do have this idea that the fate of all substance is nothing. The fate of all substance is entropy, is disorder, in other words. And I think that that fits very nicely with Spinoza's system. However, the science of logic retains nature of things by measuring towards a reflexive discourse. And neither Spinoza nor modern physics do this. And so science of logic really introduces something new with this gesture where it raises an enormous question about the fate and the destiny of substance. What's clear from Hegel's point of view is that we cannot assume that all substance is going to be reduced to nothing, precisely because of our conceptual reflexive processes of measurement. This is crucial. So here, logic of spiritual life for Hegel is subjectivity. And again, Spinoza does not think the logic of spiritual life, just thinks the logic of substance. And also does not think the quest for objective intelligibility, which Hegel claims satisfies essence. So basically what Hegel's philosophy is trying to do is think substance and subject. And he's thinking about the quest for objective intelligibility. And that is where he also breaks from Kant, where Kant is just thinking subjectivity, but is saying that we cannot have objective intelligibility. And so for Hegel, because of Kant's dialectic ends in that negative form, meaning the antinomies of reason, that Kant does not satisfy essence. Spinoza does not satisfy essence. And so when we study the science of logic in the course, what we're going to be doing a lot of the time is trying to think through how we can connect being, essence, and concept towards objective intelligibility. And this is, you know, basically what's going on here in the largest historical context is this shift from an objectivity which is purely physical, an objectivity which excludes the subject, an objectivity of substance, and towards an objectivity that includes subjectivity. That's the biggest level picture that I could paint about what's going on with Hegel's philosophy. Okay, so as I've sort of already pointed towards, Hegel has an ambiguous and a complex relationship with Spinoza. He obviously admires Spinoza a great deal, but he also has many areas where he departs fundamentally with Spinoza. One of the things Hegel does sort of commend Spinoza for is he sees and respects Spinoza for is that he sees Spinoza as a logical conclusion of classical metaphysics. And in terms of founding all things in the absolute. So Spinoza, you know, and I've seen this also in sort of the historical performativity of scientists, is that Spinoza's metaphysics goes really well with a classical science, which is only thinking substance and not subject. However, there's a huge price to be paid for this. And that is, from Hegel's point of view, that the absolute becomes simply an abstraction, which is emptied of any inner measure, and again, reduced to nothing. And again, I want to sort of say, as like the meta point of this entire presentation, is that for Hegel, the fact that the concept can measure substance, the fact that the concept not only measures substance, but from that measurement process, it's not that the substance is reduced to nothing, but that the negativity of those identities which are measured produce a new quality, something new comes out. And it's this mystery of the new, the mystery of the new and the mystery of the process of becoming, which then becomes front and center for post-Hegelian philosophy. If you think about figures like Nietzsche, think about figures like Bergson, think about figures like Deleuze, everything is about the mystery of the new and the mystery of becoming. And that's a consequence of Hegel's logic. Okay, so for Hegel, Spinoza lacks positivization of absolute negativity. Now, what's crucial when you read The Science of Logic is that it's obvious that Hegel is using the concept of absolute negativity as almost a fundamental concept. But the thing is that whenever this concept is reached, there's always a positivization to this absolute negativity. It's almost like the power of, to put it in like very like colloquial or like common everyday terms, it's almost like, and this is derived from like phenomenology of spirit, and would be a phenomenological way of describing it. It would almost like be the power of confronting your own death. It's like the power of confronting your own death for Hegel does not result in nothing. It results in a positivization. And this is the key, I think, to subjectivity. And I think that's also one of the keys to understanding the preface of the phenomenology of spirit. But including subjectivity means including discursivity, or what Hegel will call concept as concept. And really what he's saying here is that philosophy has, from Plato, like thinking here, Whitehead saying all of philosophy is but a footnote on Plato. Plato was able to think the idea. Plato was able to use dialectics to think about this notion of an absolute idea, but he wasn't able to think about our very discursive processes, our very intersubjectivity in a historical process as historically mediating the absolute idea. That the absolute idea emerges from those very processes of discursivity. That's another reflexive step, which, according to Hegel, Plato cannot think. And now, whether or not Plato can think that idea, I'll leave that to your own judgment and your own historical study and your own philosophical study. But that's certainly what Hegel's telling us about Plato. Okay. So the concept as concept. Now, this is where Hegel gets really both next level and I think incredibly controversial for a lot of people, is that for Hegel, the concept as concept is basically equal to entering God's mind before the creation of the world. Now, what does this mean? Let's put this in the context of Plato's philosophy, because Plato's philosophy is often seen as the philosophical foundation of Christianity, where there's this idea of God, or this idea of the absolute idea, which is distinct from the actual. I think that's the best way to describe it. Now, Hegel's saying that Plato cannot think the history of the idea and the concept as concept, the concept as our historical processes of discursivity. That means that we can actually enter into this idea. And this is where the science of logic leads. The science of logic leads to the absolute idea, that we can enter into, let's say, the mind of God, or the absolute idea. And what does it mean to enter into that mind before the creation of the world? What it means is not the physical world, but the universe of meaning. And creation here is equal to the conceptual medium that will make reality intelligible. So if you think about even what I'm trying to do with Philosophy Portal, there is something in Philosophy Portal which is a kind of godlike effort, or a godlike intention, or attempt, or move. One of the reasons is because it's the attempt to create a universe of meaning. And it's also being done through the creation of a conceptual medium that is trying to make reality intelligible in a new way. And this is what Hegel's really interested in. He's interested in the way in which universes of meaning emerge, and the way in which that's done through a conceptual medium that will give a new intelligibility to reality. So reason manifests its power here by investing in nature, in meaning, and working of the finite concept. So where is sort of, let's say, the solution to the meaning crisis, let's say, in those terms, it's twofold. One, it's entering the concept as concept, which is the absolute idea. This allows for the creation of a new intelligibility and new meaning, and that's only possible by working the finite concept. And that is the shift between the spurious infinity and the self-abiding infinity. You cannot get out of the fact that you are a finite concept. You cannot get out of the fact that you have to work. The question is, and this is where this naturally leads to Marxist philosophy, because a lot of Marxist philosophy is about owning your own labor, owning your own production processes, that you don't want to be a slave to labor processes. You don't want to be a slave to work processes, which are preventing you from actualizing your own logical becoming. So it's easy to see how you get from Hegel's philosophy to Marx's philosophy and the relationship between the two. Okay, so the goal here is the achievement of an intelligibility that will satisfy reason. And here, Hegel separates from Kant's project by abandoning all ideas of a thing in itself. There's no more noumenal thing in itself. It's just our spiritual process of becoming. He sheds this thing in itself. It's sort of a process of phenomenological investigation, which I suppose Hegel would say that Kant himself did not complete. And he might even say that philosophers before him had not properly completed. Perhaps he would say that philosophers had not properly tested themselves in the appearances, the phenomenological appearances of their own self. In any case, the concept has itself as an object. And what's so crucial here, and this is one of my favorite ideas in Hegel, where I think this opens up so many interesting thoughts, and it's another interesting triad which appears in the Science of Logic, which we're going into in great detail in the book itself. It's the relationship between the particular and the singular as itself coinciding with the universal. When we usually think about universality, we usually think about something which is distinct and separate from the particular and the singular. But with Hegel, we can no longer do that. We have to accept that the particular, our particular subjectivity, our finite being, and the singularity of our processes of conceptualization coincide with universality. And this is the only way, in my view, that you could ever hope to understand in a scientific way the very appearance of science itself, which is mediated by particular singular individuals, which are historically unique and unrepeatable. You know, people like Newton or people like Darwin are particular singular conceptual entities which coincide with universality. You cannot separate the two. So that's super crucial. So as a consequence of the logic, Hegel is seen as the first example of a self-standing, self-justifying discourse, a fully determined concept of the concept, whereas all previous discourses were this or that discourse about conceptualization, but they did not self-reflectively understand concept as concept. And for Hegel, this is necessary to go from just a classical objectivity to a form of subjectivity to subjectivity's objectivity. That is an objectivity derived from moving through particular subjectivity. And that's another huge dimension of what's at stake in Hegel's work. So the difference between abstract and concrete discourse here is really where, let's say, there's so much at stake with Hegel's notion of objectivity. It's what we really shift to in thinking now is if we fully accept Hegel's logic, is less and more developed forms of objectivity. So for example, and on the level of concept as concept. So for example, like all of the figures that I would sort of say are like intellectual giants, like let's say the intellectual giants of our age, like a Stephen Hawking or a Richard Dawkins in various fields, is these intellectual giants are more developed forms of objectivity than, let's say, me. Now, I would say if you're measuring me as a self-abiding infinity, I would say that from the process of moving through my doctoral program, through that measurement process, I became more objective as a concept. Now, through the process of building Philosophy Portal, again, more objective. So the thing here is when you find ways to contain your notion and mediate a deeper form of logical becoming, for Hegel, you become more objective as a socio-historical form of concept as concept. Now, in terms of classical forms of objectivity, when we think about things like mechanism, chemism, and teleology, Hegel says these are forms of objectivity that are important in different experiential contexts, but they're always in relationship to the concept as concept. So when we think mechanism, it's sort of like, how does the concept set up, like, let's say, algorithmic processes? When we think about chemism, we're thinking about sort of, let's say, the relationality between being and other, because chemistry introduces that dimension of otherness, which it cannot be just reduced to, let's say, mechanical laws. And teleology is where we get into self-direction, purpose of the concept, right? All of these are critical in different experiential contexts, and we go into all of these in the course itself. So I think we're approaching the end here, but the logic concludes with the idea of the self as an object. You take yourself as an object, you know yourself to be the source of what Plato derived from the absolute idea outside of ourselves, of the good, the true, the beautiful. That means your processes of self-measuring the good, the true, and the beautiful are the thing in itself. You know, what you see as good, what you see as true, what you see as beautiful, depending on the objectivity of your concept, that's the becoming of the absolute idea. You know, so it's a very interesting to think in this way, and you become very self-reflective about your own self and your own determinations, your own measurements. So Hegel achieves truth, and then finally, Hegel achieves truth positively in forms of human institutions, meaning that, you know, and I think this is so interesting to think about this in relationship to post-Hegelian philosophy. You know, Marx's philosophy, various philosophies, also Nietzsche's philosophy, is that for Hegel, you cannot find the ultimate truth in a world socially, collectively, without building the institutions where the concept will find satisfaction. So again, if I think about myself in this process, you know, building Philosophy Portal is in some sense an attempt to build a human institution, right, where satisfaction can be found conceptually. So Hegel is so self-reflective. Hegel just allows you to reflect on, you know, the more you're open to his determinations, the more you're capable of, I think, making sense of yourself in a philosophically rigorous and intense way. Okay. Okay, so the end of logic, the end of the long reflective discourse, you know, what is the logic? And this is so, you know, this brings us back to the first categories that we were dealing with, the categories of being and nothing, and the qualitative immediacy of those categories, is that reflection is responsible for the immediacy first expressed in the categories being and nothing. So ultimately, at the end of the day, when it comes to your self-reflection, what you're responsible for mostly is this oscillation between being and nothing as an immediacy. Your responsibility is equal to the mediation or the containment of various forms of becoming. And that's ultimately up to yourself. No one else can do that for you. If you think other people can contain you, if you think other people can mediate your becoming, that would be sort of a delusion of the big other, to put it in Zizkian terms. And finally, so the category of method brings logic to an end. The last reflections are on method. And here we have to think of the distinction between Kantian method and Hegelian method. So for Kant, method discovers and experience something which remains external, the thing in itself. But for Hegel, the method is the rhythm of experience itself. And the concept is ordering what is internal to it. So experience is a logical idealizing process. And here we bring together so many misunderstandings, both of Hegel's philosophy and I think common everyday discourse between, let's say, experience and ideas. You might say ideas are not experiences. You can also say, experiences are not ideas. But for Hegel, he's thinking experience and ideas, the immediacy of experience and the logical mediation of ideas. You can't get out of it. It's connected. It's connected. And that's the method. The rhythm of experience is accepting the dialectical process as the very conceptual mediation of experience itself, as the thing in itself. So that is Hegel's logic, its development and interpretation. And that brings us to the end of Hegel's Science of Logic pre-course. So for all of you who have been with me through this process, thank you so much for your time and attention. For those watching online, thank you so much for taking the time to watch these videos. And that brings us to the end, but it is not the end for those of us going into the Science of Logic course, which starts tomorrow. There are 4 tiers available: recorded, live, expert, and one-on-one. For the next 3.5 months, almost 4 months, we are going to be meditating on all of these dimensions of Hegel's logic, which are so essential to thinking about day-to-day life, so essential for thinking about our intellect as a process, and so important for interpreting the modern world, science, spirituality, religion, the containment of becoming, and ultimately the post-Hegelian field of philosophy. How well have philosophers in the last 200 years understood Hegel's attempt to build a philosophical science? And with that, I will end and thank you for your attention. All right, so anyone who wants to jump in here, we can chop it up.
Yeah, so the objectivity of the concept is derived from mediating your notions in a concrete manner. That's how I understand it. And, what pops up to me is, I was recently watching this TV show and there was this 18-year-old girl and she said that, she's going to do OnlyFans, and she actually did OnlyFans actually. And she was getting lots of money for this. So next to her in this TV program, there sits an ex-sex worker, and she's telling her, you're going to regret this. Like, I did gangbangs when I was 19 and I'm on Pornhub and I hate it. I regret it totally. So, and she said, you don't have the age to know what you're doing. And then this 18-year-old said, yes, it's my decision. And if I'm regret it, it's my fault, but I know I won't regret it because, it's my decision and I'm an adult now, and all this kind of funny stuff. So what's so funny to me, and of course this pops up in our own lives many times when we meet someone who's younger or someone who has not experienced the same thing as we do, that you cannot explain to them, like, look, this is not how it works. Because in other people who have experienced the same thing, or, have gone through a certain similar developmental development in their lives, they get you, when you talk with them about some, I guess, sex work in this case. So how would you relate this to the objectivity of the concept?
Yeah, I would relate this to, again, so much is at stake. And it's also so, I just enjoy playing with these ideas a lot, is thinking about less and more developed forms of objectivity. There are certain, and this is probably what's so difficult about being a parent. I could just, basically in terms of because when you have a child, I mean, a baby, an infant, is just pure subjective affect. When it cries, it cries. When it's angry. They're just a lot of intensity of subjectivity. The whole process of conceptually containing yourself and building and then you try to contain yourself, like when you try to talk for the first time and you learn language for the first, and this, we can go on and on with examples of this developmental process of deepening objectivity. But the objectivity is never finished or complete, and your objectivity is always broken apart, and that's always very painful. And that's why it's so hard to not only think conceptual objectivity, but to become a deep conceptual object oneself. So let me just give one example that I resonated with, or came to my mind while you were describing what you were describing. Is I remember my brother had his first girlfriend after I had already had a few breakups. And I could tell that this girlfriend was a nightmare. I could tell she had dated lots of other guys. I was like, Brendan, you're just gonna get destroyed here. It's like you have no chance. But he had to go through it himself. I couldn't tell him from the outside. And that's all. And that's what's so painful about being, I think that's what's so painful about being let's say a deeper conceptual objectivity, is that you see someone, you're gonna make a mistake. This is not going to go well. You know it's not going to go well, but you sort of have to just help them fail well. I think that's what's crucial. Is like for example with my brother, it was like you just have to be there for them when it goes wrong, and you can't from the outside judge them. Like Hegel has a whole section in the concept chapter where he talks about judgment. And so I think those are things that we have to work through in the book itself.
Can I ask a question just regarding this example? If I'm in the position of knowing that this girlfriend is not good for me, seeing myself actually dating her and going in it.
Yeah.
What? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you learn through failure, right? Like I could just say for me, when I my first 3 serious relationships didn't end well, let's say. Now, does that mean I shouldn't have dated them? Not necessarily that. It's that the mistake would be not learning from the failures. Right? Like it's all about how you, like for Hegel, it's all about how you accept negativity. You accept almost like the tragedy of being, because if you think from the first concepts in his logic, it's being and nothing. So there's tragedy built into being from the start. If you see nothing as a tragedy, right? If you see nothing as nihilism or something like that. So it's built in. And so the whole deepening of becoming is sort of like the paradox of, for example, doing something you really care about, doing something you're really passionate about, fully knowing that it's going to eventually fall apart or come apart. It's not going to be the eternal final idea. How does that sit with you?
I think that maybe I'm going to take a more concrete example. It's recently I realized the extent to which I tended to go into multiple paths at the same time in order not to be present and to stay safe.
Yeah.
So now that I'm aware of this blind spot, I'm seeing myself doing it, but not being able to stop myself.
Yeah. So I really think let me put this in philosophical context. One of the biggest philosophers of the 20th century is obviously someone like Gilles Deleuze, who's got a philosophy of becoming also, but his philosophy of becoming is towards a multiplicity of multiplicities without any one. So what I think we're in with this age, with this idea of multiplicity of multiplicities, is fear of the failure, fear of the one, fear of being burned by your own intensity, basically burned by the process of becoming an objective concept in Hegelian terms. So how do you stop doing that? Ultimately, to me, I think this is one of the reasons why I tried to teach Thus Spoke Zarathustra, because I'm not saying, Joel, just go read Thus Spoke Zarathustra and you'll figure it out. But the thing is that what's so great about the character of Zarathustra is the way in which he sees loss as success. the way in which he sees his own down going as the way. So I mean, you have to. So basically, there's no getting out of taking risks. You know, you have to accept that on a deep emotional level. Like here, let me just talk about like the affects I feel before doing a live stream like this. Like every time I set up one of these live streams, I have no idea who's going to show up or if anyone is going to show up. Right? I could fail every time I try. Right, and eventually, you know, that the whole thing will yeah, who knows what the possibility of what I'm doing is, but eventually it's not going to last forever. So the point, but anyway, I'm going to try and do it. So now, whatever that is for you, that's not like mean that you do what I do, but whatever it is that really moves you and brings you to that edge of anxiety where you're like, I could really fail here. You know, that's what I'm trying to communicate. We have to become friends with this space. You know, I'll do a little meditative ritual and stuff like that to be with that anxiety. This is what you do before, right? Call. Like before, like 5 minutes. Like again, that feeling that and that also tells you what. I also think it tells you you're in the right spot as well. Because if I didn't feel anxiety about becoming on one of these things, it would also mean that I don't care about what I'm doing. I remember when I was like. I'm really young, like 9, I was at like this summer camp and we were in this play and it didn't matter like what I was doing. It was like a Batman play. I was a character in the Batman play. And I was like, had so much anxiety about my turn to go on the stage that when it was my turn to go on the stage, I just ran out of the building and ran home. It was like, you know, but it was like, but it's that you're containing that emotion, right? It probably meant at the time, it was like it's really important for you to like be a good performer in that play. Nice. Thanks for this, Cadell. And welcome, Timothy. Nice to see you here. Max, you're in just like the pure, you're in the Spinozan abyss there. It's like there's no hope for you there, Max.
That's what it's like all the time. So we have, because I've been reading the Science of Logic, and it's a fucking hard book. It's a really hard book for me to orientate myself. Like for the past few weeks, I've been reading the introduction, the prefaces. Then I've sort of got a hang on being, and now I've gone into existence, and I'm like, oh my god, Hegel, what are you doing?
It doesn't get easier.
So, but listening to Hoolgate, he's helped me a lot in saying what the Science of Logic is about. He says it here. It sets out to examine the simplest and most basic general categories with which we think, such as being, reality, something, limit, form, content, cause, concepts through which we formulate our minimal understanding. So Hegel is saying in the history of Western philosophy, we have assumed these categories.
Yeah.
And what is he trying to derive new categories? Is he trying to be experimental? How does he approach this problem and the science of logic?
So from the lecture I just gave, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is the way, and like on a meta level, like when you're going deeper into your study, and don't get too concerned about the book being difficult, because that's in part what the course is going to be for. Like I'm going to try to do everything I can to make this understandable in an intimate way. But the crucial thing here is think about what I was saying about Hegel's relation to Spinoza, and pay attention to Hegel's relation to Spinoza throughout the book. Because what he's saying about Spinoza is not so much that Spinoza is using the wrong categories. He's almost saying Spinoza's categories are fine in some sense. What he's saying is that Spinoza didn't understand those categories from the point of view of subject, which means Spinoza was understanding those categories from the point of view of identity, substantial identity, as opposed to contradiction. So very practically, when you think about the ground of existence, so the ground of existence for me is this apartment I'm in right now, or appearances. You guys are appearing to me right now. or just existence, what I feel as the essence of my Cadelness right now. Hegel's saying all of those things need to be worked through as contradictions. Where you're living, how being appears to you, the quality of your experience, all of these are being worked through through self-contradiction. And he's saying Spinoza doesn't give you that. Spinoza can't think that. Spinoza can't think historical subjectivity.
Yeah.
I was thinking, excuse me.
I'll just finish this and then
Yeah.
and you go on Dawson. It's just thinking about the idea of these categories. Hegel is sort of saying that these are sort of arbitrary. I mean, and then relating it to what we've been doing in Zarathustra, where he's calling for a reevaluation. In a sense, these categories that we use for thought aren't seen as a value set, but you know, in a sense they are, because why don't we use negation instead of cause? Why is cause the immediate thing that we go to explain reality? Why don't we explain something in terms of God? You know, you really put your heart and soul into that. You really negated yourself because of that, as a scientific category for thought. That there could be a form of reevaluation within these categories themselves and how we orientate ourselves in the world.
Well, Hegel does have large sections in the logic for thinking about causality as causality. Like thinking about for thinking about causality as concept. So let me give some historical background for what that means. Think about the relation between Descartes and Hume. You know how Daniel Garner loves David Hume? Okay, so Descartes is a rationalist. And Descartes, you set up with Descartes the Cartesian coordinate system, which allows you to derive cause and effect. Now, what Hume's saying is that this cause and effect, these linear causes and effects, cannot be understood as they were just derived from Descartes' reason. They're not connected to day-to-day experience. That's why Daniel Garner emphasizes all the time day-to-day experience and common life, because that's very Humean to emphasize. Now, what Hegel's saying is that we need to think experience and the idea together. So we can't just think about the idea disconnected from experience, and we can't just think about experience and then sort of think ideas and theories are not important. So what Hegel's trying to do is to demonstrate the way whereas Descartes would in some sense have, again, a naive relationship to causality and external substance, thinking that his causal matrix reflects the substance outside. Hegel's saying we have to think cause and effect internal to the concept itself, how it's being used to mediate certain experiences. And from this, Hegel derives all sorts of weird things that we would today call nonlinear causality. How cause becomes effect, how effect becomes cause, how the effect is contained in the cause, how the cause contains the effect. All of these are within the concept, not necessarily in experience. But nonetheless, the application of those ideas to experience does have certain measurement effects, right? Like the Cartesian coordinate system or Newtonian mechanics. Again, the meaning of that is it gets you to the moon, which is a new experience. It's not like humans had experienced going to the moon before, but they mediated that process through conceptual frameworks, which are limited, but nonetheless powerful in that limitation. And then we could derive different logics. And like we have, like a lot of what cybernetics is about is thinking about nonlinear causality, which is a post-Cartesian causality, where you have these feedback loops where cause and effect are linked with each other. I'm going to try and also in the course itself, I'm going to do the best I can to situate all of these ideas in their historical context and like in relationship to like, you know, Hume and Descartes and like rationalism and empiricism and like what's really being said here, like what's really new here.
Kedal, what is the minimum level in terms of like philosophical knowledge that is required to follow science of logic course?
It's a difficult question. Like, let me give you some like historical background on myself. So it's like, surprise, but I actually never took an academic philosophy course. I've never taken an academic philosophy course. Now that doesn't mean I'm uneducated. Like, so I don't know what your educational background is, but my educational background was I was in the evolutionary sciences and stuff like that. And I stumbled upon the necessity of philosophy. So the question for me would be, do you have, and what's your educational background, and where are you in terms of stumbling into the necessity of philosophy for your own self-reflection? And, you know, I think a lot of it for me comes down to the motivation inside yourself, but also educational background is like, it gives you sort of an a priori, you know, conceptual work.
Yeah, so I've studied macroeconomics, and I kind of dropped out, didn't finish the master. So I'm not like, in terms of education, it's quite limited. I mean, limited. I was at ULB at Solvay. And basically, why I'm interested to do this, it's because have multiple projects that I'm starting, or that I have right now, that might benefit from Hegelian thinking. One is about helping DAOs to measure value practice alignment and identify blind spots. Another one is to help, is to work on a new concept, which is the androgynous organization that can be both top down and bottom up, centralized, decentralized. It's connected to Fanny's work and Bartlett stuff. So I've always, like, when I was in studying economics, I was going to the events of the Masters of Philosophy, and I was engaging and I was really into it, but I don't have like the reading background, etc. I know I have a great thinking mind, but I don't have the books, and when you talk like some of the vocabulary, I need a lexic, you know. So yeah.
Sure. You know what? I mean, those are really cool projects. So I'm like pretty deep into designing the course, and when I'm designing the course, one of my goals is to try to link, not just like teach the text, but I want to link the text to our contemporary scientific environment, our contemporary social problems, like things that are going on. So like, at least with the way I'm going to try and teach this course, I want you to be hit with all of these examples, which are extremely practical and potentially relevant for projects you have going on in your life. The other thing, as it relates to some of the ideas that are coming up just based on the projects you said you're working on, is like the other instructors that will also be teaching are like fantastic for thinking like, what is the relation about this to economics? What is the relation about this to machine learning? What is the relation of this to, you know, various fields? Like, each of them are going to have their own speciality. So the reason why I think that's a nice complement to the course is because it's going to show you the way in which, let's say, different figures within our various liminal web spaces are actually working with these ideas. You know, like, these ideas are alive right now. And so, and there's some other, like, there's another guy who's taking the course who's an engineer who's really focused on how can I apply these to my own studies, for example. So I think that's going to be a deep aspect of the course. And I can't say for sure if this course will be what you're looking for, but you know, we'd have to go into, I guess, I'm open to you like describing a little bit more about what these projects are.
Yeah, I think this would require maybe a one-on-one, or, I mean, I can talk about it now but this is also why I wanted to talk with you.
Let's set up a one-on-one after this, and we'll maybe tomorrow or something like that, or the day after.
Okay, I'm in the middle of like a training, super intense training, trauma, somatic stuff.
We'll talk on Facebook about it.
Cool.
All right. Dawson, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, so the reason I was speaking up earlier was because we were on Spinoza, and that connected to something that I wanted to contribute to this discussion. We went over today about how Spinoza's idea of the absolute as this pure abstraction becomes this negativity. It becomes this universal that's this all-encompassing negativity. And I thought it was interesting just the way that the logos of Hegel in response to Spinoza, where it's like a positive affirmation of the negative, it reminds me a lot of, like, from Spinoza to Hegel reminds me a lot of Buddhism and also Lacan in that context, especially like Buddhism as this same sort of theological strain, which is based on this void, this negativity, that's this all-encompassing thing. The relationship between Spinoza and Buddhism, I think, is pretty evident there, or apparent. And then also, like, I think it could be interesting to think of, Hegel in response to that same negativity of Spinoza, and Lacan's response to Buddhism in the context of desire, split subjectivity. And it's interesting the way, like, Lacan uses language so that and his conceptualization of the signifier is such that we are beings in language, like our whole apparatus from the time we're a child and we cry out to be fed, or it's like this, the signifier becomes a way that we're able to articulate our entire experience. And it's through this conceptual apparatus of, like, there's which it's interesting to think of that in terms of the logos of Hegel. And I see right from there, like,
so
where,
think about this. I started the presentation with the emphasis on logos as becoming. And in previous lectures, I was saying, like, you can't get out of now. There are lots of people that try, right? Like, and Buddhism is one example, but Lacan's definition of a subject is the subject is what relates a signifier to another signifier. Right? So it's logical becoming. And he talks about logical time, and Lacan is very much, and think about what psychoanalytic method is. You're free associating in your speech, your language, right? And you're relating signifier to signifier.
I'd be curious to think about Hegel in terms of the unconscious, like where does logos enter into the unconscious, and how does that function? I think that's a big question.
It's a huge question. And in some sense, this question of, and I'm going to try and bring this out in the course itself, is the relationship between what's going on in Hegel's science of logic and what you could call post-Hegelian content. Like, psychoanalysis did not exist in Hegel's time, right? So that's a post-Hegelian content, which we could think about with the dialectic. And indeed, Zizek does do that, right? Like, if you look at Zizek's philosophy, like in his recent book, Surplus Enjoyment, he's analyzing that psychoanalytic clinic as a historical content, right? So we can do these types of studies, right? So it's not just from Hegel to Lacan, it also could go from Lacan back to Hegel, right? Or back to thinking with the dialectic about the historicity of the psychoanalytic process. But this question of, can Hegel think the Freudian unconscious, is something which Zizek brings out in a book chapter of Less Than Nothing titled The Limits of Hegel, where he talks about the ways that, because Hegel does conceptualize the unconscious, as does Schelling. They're aware of the unconscious, but is it as a well-developed concept as it becomes in Freud? Because why? Because Freud develops his whole, he dedicates his whole career to studying it. So he has, the concept matures, the concept develops, and then it's interesting to think, like, for example, like one of my things I always said, like, well, two things, let's say. What was one of the first things that happened after Hegel is Marx, because what did Marx say? He said, there's not enough political economy in Hegel. Hegel didn't understand capitalism well enough, right? So we have, and like, think about contemporary capitalism. It's totally a post-Hegelian phenomenon the way it exists now. And then another thing that I think you could say about Hegel's work is that, is sexuality really brought out explicitly enough in Hegel? I think that's a valid question, right? Like, but at the same time, with a psychoanalytic training, I can read sexuality in Hegel still, and there are aspects of the phenomenology of spirit where he does deal with it. It's just not developed well enough. I mean, these are all positive negativities because it gives us things to do as well. Like it gives us things to work on and find new ways to conceive of these problems and these things. I think one of the most powerful things for me, and again, something I'll try to bring out in the course, is like, what would Hegel think about artificial intelligence? Like artificial intelligence is totally a post-Hegelian phenomenon. There's so many things that exist today that didn't exist in Hegel's time, but it's like, that's why Zizek always says, it's not what we think about Hegel, but what Hegel would think about us. And this also is necessary to we'll get to you, Dimitri, now, but this is also important because you can't understand Hegel if you're going in with your ego and you're trying to judge him. You have to empty yourself to get it. And and that's a submission process. And I actually was talking to someone who's like a really good philosopher who was telling me that the first time I read Hegel, I just had all these ideas against Hegel in my head and I couldn't understand it. You know, so that's it's important thing to take to heart. Dimitri?
Yes, is it, with all the changes since Hegel, is it time for philosophers this day and age to write a Science of Logic 2.0?
Yeah, so that's so now the thing is that like one of the reasons why in these pre-course sessions I've been emphasizing Hegel's age is like Hegel wrote the Science of Logic in his 40s. He spent his 30s doing the phenomenological groundwork. And one of the things I want to emphasize that to you guys is not only to contextualize me and my age, right? Like I'm 36, I've written certain things, you know, in my 40s, maybe prepare for a different project, but give yourselves time. Hegel wrote his big work in his 40s, or, you know, in his late 30s and his 40s. The question about Science of Logic Part 2 would be, like, to get to more specifically to that question, would be, Hegel's clear in relationship to Aristotle that it's not that Aristotle is an idiot, it's just that there's so much that's changed in the last 2,000 years that logic itself needs to be updated. It's just become a dead, empty form. It no longer applies to it no longer fits to the time. So the question would be as it relates to logic, but I would say to expand, maybe we need to think in many different dimensions, not just phenomenology and logic, but we could focus on that. Is one, has Hegel's logic even been applied to what's going on today yet? That would be like, the thing is, if you wrote something like the equivalent of what would be considered a Science of Logic Part 2, it might take people another couple hundred years to understand it in the first place. It doesn't seem to me like we've even understood Hegel yet. So that to me is the primary task. And then the consequences of that task would open up probably something new. And what that is, like Hegel would say, you can't predict in advance. Hegel's philosophy, you can't predict the future. But like one of the things that I'm already going to emphasize in the first classes is like, when you think about the biggest philosophers in the last 200 years, a lot of them are emphasizing the concept of becoming, but it doesn't seem to me like any of them are emphasizing that the becoming is derived from containing being and nothing. And what is left out by missing that point is that you have philosophies of becoming which are too positivistic and end up in abstract nothingness because they don't really take the tragedy of existence seriously enough. They become too abstract, they become too disconnected.
So is it like I was fasting again, and then it was just nothing, you know.
Yeah.
And then I made this plate, and it was being,
Yeah.
and then I ate it again way too quickly, and then there was nothing.
Yeah.
Is this a good application of the Hegelian logic?
Yeah, because now that I like keeping it now, like let's
Kept
merge
sedating itself.
Yeah, let's merge psychoanalysis and Hegel here when we think about the basic drives of the body. For psychoanalysis, reality emerges through different drives. Oral drive, anal drive, genital drive, nasal, scopic, vision, all of these drives. Now, all of these drives struggle with the immediacy of being a nothing. The oral drive struggles with the presence or absence of food. The genital drive with the presence or absence of a sexual partner, and so forth and so on. It's the mediation of all of these drives where maturity is derived. Because, like, I was watching a documentary with my partner about people who basically it's a really a stupid reality show about, but you can learn things on stupid reality shows depending on how you pay attention to them. It was a reality show about people who can't stop eating. It's called My 600-Pound Life. There are people who are 600 pounds. And because they can't, and the reason why they're 600 pounds is that they cannot, for the life of them, confront the lack of the oral drive. They become too emotionally charged. They have to constantly eat, or else they just go into an emotional breakdown. It's like, but like people struggle with that. Like, and so like, and like, or like, for example, people, I like study guys in the manosphere who have like what you could call like a sexual addiction, where they have like many partners and they just constantly interchange them constantly. Is like these people can't deal with both attaching to someone and being vulnerable with someone. And they can't deal with being alone with themselves. They constantly have to have new people around them to keep them from going, I don't know, confronting themselves. So all of these things is where maturity emerges. You know, various different forms. But I think it's very powerful. Max, go ahead. Let's say you have the last question there, Max, and then we'll close it up.
You go over how we get into God's mind, according to Hegel, again.
Yeah, so what's crucial here is the way you want to pay attention to how Hegel's relating to Plato. So think about Plato, like if you can think Plato's idea of God, then we could move to Hegel's idea. Okay,
so the one, the good.
So, yeah, so we have the one, we have the ideal forms, which are the thoughts of God, right? Plato's ideal forms are the thoughts of God, but they're not in the world of actuality. The world of actuality are reflections of this, right? So they remain external to our actuality. They remain external to history. It's like you have this divide between eternity and temporality.
Two worlds.
Yeah, two worlds. You have the imperfect forms and you have the perfect forms. Now, what Hegel's saying is that metaphysics doesn't understand itself. It doesn't understand that, like, it's almost like Plato's idea, like here's for Hegel's idea of Plato. It's almost like for Hegel, Plato's absolute idea has to be understood internal to the historicity of Plato himself. It emerged from Plato's own mind and own discursivity. And from that emergence had a historical effect, right? Like the whole of philosophy is a footnote on Plato. But Plato couldn't understand that that idea was not external to him, but internal to him. He didn't step into the concept as concept. And the consequence of not stepping into the concept as concept is you might set up a shitty political philosophy. Like it could be that the Republic is a shitty political philosophy. right? He might be too naive about the idea. He might be too naive about the supremacy of philosophers in the traditional sense. Right?
So,
Like there are historical consequences for these mistakes.
so is it that when you're not including your concept in the concept, it's that you're not including your own reflection in it?
Yeah, you're not, yeah, ultimately it's not self-reflective enough. And like, so the example I was giving is like, so like, imagine me in undergrad at McMaster University writing concepts. Okay, just me, I'm just telling you about my life, but an undergrad in university talking about their concepts. Versus building something like Philosophy Portal. There you step into the concept as concept because you're building out the concept. Like I didn't build out McMaster University. I attended McMaster University and was playing with my concepts.
There's
So
something
like
about having skin in the game when you have to sort of live it.
It's easy in our contemporary deconstructionist world to criticize the institutions. It's another like Greta Thunberg against the UN. She's playing, and I can't believe they take it. Like, I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that it's one thing to do that, which is like a critique it's a critique of external cognition because you're not in it. And it's another thing to be like to actually build out an international political body. Like, do you know how many mistakes you're going to make if you're building out an international political body? It's like only going to be mistakes, and people are only going to hate you. You're going to be the subject of, it's like when I was at the system science group, I was presenting my work systems and subjects, and the people who were more scientific, they said I was too subjectivist. And the people who were more spiritualist, they said I was too scientific. So I couldn't please either of them, but that's the situation you find yourself when you're actually building out the concept, is that you cannot please everyone. At the same time, you remain not ideological, and the people who do find you are going to follow your thought. Like, you just have to focus on the people who naturally find you, as opposed to the ideological factions, which someone like Nietzsche would call like the rabble.
So the process that Hegel is asking for with the concept being in the concept is substance becoming subject. The mark of that is maturity.
Yeah, there's definitely some aspect of Hegel which is about, and in some sense he's saying, and this makes sense too, like in the history of our species, in some sense Hegel's saying our philosophers throughout history were the best that we could do at that stage of our species maturity. And so to carry on that tradition in a historical sense would be well, this is a metaphor, but what stage of our life cycle is the human species as an organism? Are we in middle age? Are we teenagers still? Are we in old age? Are we dying? You know, like these are the types of ideas that, like someone like Zizek, for example, in his later philosophy now, he's going towards these ideas of like, almost like prophetic self-sacrifice, like saying that leftist revolutionary politics should just, like take over for Christology and sacrifice itself, and like instead of stop utopianizing philosophy. But that gives me the sense that like our civilization's at the end, like we're dying, and what could emerge from that death? It'd be a new society, but it could be like that we're dying, like, because if you think about like philosophy before Zizek, it was the deconstructionist philosophy where you just deconstruct our metaphysics. Mm-hmm. It's no longer thinking about building it up towards some great future. It's about deconstructing how horrible we are because of our historical failures.
Yes. You can in a sense, because Hegel is so He's trying to make people more mature, face the negativity. You can understand why he was ignored. You can understand why there was so many wanting to return to Kant,
Oh,
to
totally.
skip to Marx, and to leave
Yeah,
Hegel.
he said that Kant, like that the critical turn in philosophy subjectivized the idea out of fear of the object.
I can't know it. I don't know it. It's not there. It's not my problem.
All right, guys. So this is the end of the pre-course sessions for Science of Logic, but course starts tomorrow. These pre-course sessions should give you an overview, and they're on YouTube forever for free. So these pre-course sessions should give you an overview of the background and the context of this book. And again, Science of Logic itself starts tomorrow, and just reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. And Timothy, I'll message you after this and we'll set up something, okay? All right, so thank you guys for your attendance, and I'll see some of you guys tomorrow.
Thanks, Cadell.